This Labor Day comes after some of the most tumultuous years in the history of the American worker. A pandemic roller coaster of historically high unemployment and now quite low unemployment numbers. Tonight, we look at what that means for workers themselves. We invited some of you over Twitter to tell us if you feel secure in your jobs. In the answers, we saw stress and exhaustion. People who say they are struggling, like this woman who said she's seeking to retire soon after years under pressure. Or this one who said she's carrying more burden than she expected to at this age. But others told us they're enjoying working from home and finding satisfying opportunities. To talk about this complicated moment, I'm joined by Maximilian Alvarez of the Real News Network and host of the Working People podcast, and Tsedal Neely, professor at the Harvard Business School. Focusing on the workers themselves, here are two powerful tweets that we received. A local school worker wrote, "COVID relief has ended. The school is understaffed and overwhelmed. The stress is unbearable." But a librarian told us, even though, quote, "we don't eat out much, don't travel, I'm more satisfied. I get to play and experiment." We want to talk about both the good and the bad, but Maximilian Alvarez, let's start with you. And which kinds of workers are struggling the most right now?
Well, it's hard to say who's struggling the most, but I think what I really want to underscore for people is that people are struggling across different industries from many of the same problems, as you mentioned in that tweet. I really want to stress for people that chronic and deliberate understaffing is probably the most common complaint that I hear from workers in retail and service. From education workers, we're starting a new school year. We have been hemorrhaging teachers because we've been underpaying, under-resourcing them, vilifying them relentlessly in the media, and now we're running out of teachers. So that is very much a crisis, but it is also happening in healthcare. Healthcare has been hemorrhaging staff after 2.5 years of the pandemic, and we have no real plan to sort of replace all these lost workers.
You're hearing that now, Tsedal Neely, about understaffing, stress on workers across the board. Where do we see workers finding more satisfaction, more flexibility? That's something you study.
One of the biggest things that came out of the global pandemic is remote work, or remote work revolution, as we've seen. It's the grandest experiment where people have had the capability to work from home. And more recently, hybrid work has been introduced more and more in companies where people have both in-person and remote experiences. That has increased job satisfaction in extraordinary ways, increased productivity, increased the ability for people to have work-life integration in ways that we've never seen in this country since the 1950s.
It's interesting. We did get a tweet about that. This person wrote, "I've seen hiring policies change, people to work completely remotely, more flexibility. All of these things have made it possible to hire the best people for the positions and better pay too." Something else we noticed, I want both of you to pay attention to in these, is sort of talking especially about unionization. Here are two more personal stories revolving around that. First, a tweet. In this, we had a heating and air conditioning tech write us that since they joined a union 6 months ago, quote, "pay is almost double." And they wrote, "I'll finally have a little more room to breathe." Here's the other, quote, "I work for a major railroad and we are about to strike." That person wrote, "We work to the point of exhaustion." Maximilian, unions had been losing workers for some decades now, but this speaks to that exhaustion factor. What is this moment right now for labor unions?
It's a really pivotal moment because, again, we have a tight labor market, the likes of which we may never see again in this century. The boomers are retiring out. A lot of people died or got sick and debilitated from COVID. And also, as I aforementioned, a lot of industries have been slashing their workforce. So, we've been hearing this no one wants to work narrative. But in fact, if you hear the workers' side of it, you'll hear folks at Chipotle, at Starbucks, at, a school in Minneapolis, or on the Class 1 freight railroads, you'll hear all of these folks screaming, "We don't have enough people. We can't even hire and retain people because we're being treated so poorly." A lot of the country probably doesn't realize that we are closer right now to a national rail shutdown on the freight railroads than we've been in my lifetime. And because workers have been run into the ground and the profit maximizing, cost cutting decisions from corporate CEOs has ruined the supply chain and turned what was once a good job into a miserable experience. It's a real crisis.
So we've been talking about something that spans different kinds of work, different stresses and different kinds of satisfaction. But you've also noticed some gaps in gender and generation that's happening right now with workers. Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. It's kind of a moment in time where there's fierce divide between employers and employees, particularly around the return to office. Those who are leaders of companies, oftentimes people of a certain age, have a perception of what the best way of work is, and oftentimes they prefer the butts and seats, command and control. On the other hand, employees who are digital natives, who are much more savvy, who can go between the in-person and the digital, prefer that disproportionately. And so this gap is massive, and I actually don't know how it's going to get resolved unless there's some kind of compromise, particularly from the sides of leaders, because we've been through the biggest lesson of our lifetimes, and well-being is another thing that people are thinking about, caring about a lot of well-being issues.
I want to ask both of you as we wrap this up, what do you think is most misunderstood about workers in America, any kind of workers, and where we're at? And Tsedal Neely, let's start with you.
They want autonomy, they want control in their lives, they want to be able to contribute and produce for their organizations in a way that also works for them from a physical standpoint, from a mental standpoint, from a family standpoint. So the kind of discontent that we're seeing with the push for return to office is because there's this loss of control, loss of autonomy, loss of integration in their lives that they so want to maintain.
Maximilian Alvarez.
You know, I think that the COVID-19 pandemic supercharged workers' understanding of their own worth because for a brief moment, this system was forced to admit how much it needs us. And all of us were able to finally recognize how much we and our fellow workers are essential. And I think that that has had a lot to do with the growing labor movement in this country, from the unionization wave to the strikes we've been seeing to record numbers of people quitting their jobs. But the backlash has been just as fierce. The bosses do not like this worker militancy, and they want to put all of us back into our place. So I think that you are seeing a real struggle between working people and a system that admits that it values our labor as essential, but not our lives. And working people are pushing back against that and saying we are worth more, and we're going to fight for it.
Maximilian Alvarez of the Real News Network and the Working People podcast, and Tsedal Neely of Harvard University's Business School. Thank you to you both.
Thank you.